When it comes to underappreciated Nintendo games, an example that's often brought up is StarTropics for the original Nintendo Entertainment System, a game where you play as 15-year-old Mike Jones arriving on the tropical Coral Island to meet up with his archaeologist uncle Dr. Stephen Jones, only to discover that he has been abducted. With yo-yo in hand, Mike sets off to find his uncle, traversing across several islands and their dangers within. You would alternate between overworld segments, exploring and talking with NPCs to figure out what to do, and action sequences where you navigate and fight your way through dungeon-like caves that play kind of like the original Legend of Zelda, but with more emphasis on grid-based platforming and jumping on blocks for its puzzle elements. This style of game, along with the catchy music and quirky sense of humor, made for a charming tropical adventure that is still fondly remembered ever since its 1990 release, marking this year as its 30th anniversary, which no doubt just made a lot of fans, even those that weren't born yet in 1990, feel that much older. It's certainly one of those games you've likely at least heard of people gushing over. It's how I came about it during the old YouTube days of forgotten retro games you should totally check out, and I got my copy shortly after I started collecting NES games. Shouts to Derek of Stop Skeletons from Fighting, been following him since his Neckbone days. Neckbone! Though I didn't get too far into it initially and only recently played through the whole thing for this video, and while there are a few aspects I do feel are just a little archaic, I can see why this has kept its cult classic status. But despite that, StarTropics has continued to be one of Nintendo's more obscure intellectual properties, seemingly not getting much recognition from Nintendo themselves outside of a few re-releases throughout the years. Not to mention that this only got a single sequel and nothing else. Which brings us to the topic of this video, Zoda's Revenge StarTropics 2. While not the most unknown sequel out there, I imagine some StarTropics fans may have had this slip under their radar only to discover it way later and go, wait, they made a sequel? Calling it Zoda's Revenge StarTropics 2 probably didn't help. It should have been the other way around. That and Zoda's Revenge comes across as assuming you even know that this Zoda guy was the villain from StarTropics who only shows up near the end of the game. Regardless, while not as revered as the first game by some StarTropics fans, it is often considered decent enough to at least give it a playthrough by others. So let's find out why that is, shall we? Upon booting up, we get a title screen that isn't quite as memorable as the first game's Fade to Starry Night sequence. Just a splash title with Zoda's fingers making the V on Revenge. I think it's kinda dumb. However, there is a neat little main cast recap through a book that plays out to get you up to speed with those characters. Oh wow, this came out in 1994, that's a very late release for an NES game. That is already a big reason why I consider this "they made a sequel" material. By 1994, most gamers were fully committed to the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, and while the release of other games like Mega Man 6 along with the top loader did keep the NES going, the system would inevitably be discontinued shortly after. Still, it is pretty cool to see the NES last as long as it did, and that this was one of the last official games for it. In fact, this was the last Nintendo-made exclusive for the NES. Both StarTropics were developed by Nintendo Research and Development 3, who also made the original Punch-Out games for the arcade, NES, and SNES on top of hardware development. I suspect that a reason why StarTropics 2 wasn't on the Super Nintendo is that they were focused on making Super Punch-Out as their SNES game that year. What's also interesting is that the StarTropics games were made specifically for Western audiences and have never gotten Japanese releases despite being made in Japan, with R&D 3 manager Genyo Takada being a director for the first game, a producer for the second, and a screenwriter for both games. Though StarTropics 2 did have American development with additional story writers, because while StarTropics 1 did do a pretty good job in appealing to Westerners, you could tell at times it was made by Japanese developers. So the American writers were likely brought on board to ensure that 2 would have a more authentic Western style to it. Starting the game reintroduces us to Mike Jones, rocking a blue denim jacket this time, who explains that he is back home in Seattle and even asks if we remember his uncle. Which you can actually say no and he'll tell you to read the manual for some fourth wall breaking humor right off the bat. Whether you remember him or not, Mike tells us that his uncle has been busy trying to solve a cipher from the previous game. Oh, quick warning, there's going to be a lot of StarTropics spoilers in this video since this is a sequel after all, so be prepared for that if you don't want these games spoiled for you. Said cipher was on an alien escape pod containing the last of the Argonians, no relation to the Elder Scrolls kind, who were fleeing from Zoda. Mike then gets a telepathic call from Mika, or is it Micah? I don't know, people are probably going to yell at me for pronouncing it either way anyway. The princess of the Argonians that she and 6 other Argonian kids were rescued from at the end of the first game. She then tells Mike a clue in order to solve the cipher that was spoken to her in a dream from her father, King Hirokan. Giving this information to Dr. Jones reveals that the cipher is in reverse, and with an Oxford Wonder World book, the words of the cipher are read aloud, which causes Mike to suddenly get whisked away to begin his new adventure. We then get to control Mike as he finds himself transported to the Ice Age. It's here the game quickly reacquaints us with the two gameplay styles of StarTropics, with the overworld exploration portions playing about the same as before, while falling into these pits throws you right away into short action sequences. This is where you'll notice the biggest change with StarTropics 2, as Mike can now move in 8 directions as opposed to 4 in the last game. It's also a little less restrictive in that you can more quickly change directions, while StarTropics 1's was strictly grid-based, having you first face a direction then hold that direction to move. It did feel a little stiff, but because that game was designed around that square-based movement, it did click in once you got used to it. Adding more directional control is ambitious, but it comes at the cost of having some issues around it. It's still not nearly as smooth as, say, A Link to the Past with its 8-directional movement, as it does retain some of the inherent momentum and stiffness. The jumping is a good showcase of that too, as you can also jump around more freely, yet it makes platforming more awkward than it should be. In the last game, jumping was primarily used on tracks of blocks that you hopped across at set distances. Much like the movement, it can seem restrictive, and the fact you can't even jump forward elsewhere did throw me off. But they locked your position in place, making it so you only had to worry about the distance and timing of jumping across these throughout the game. There was even a power-up late in the game that doubled your jump distance to mix things up as well. In StarTropics 2, you aren't locked onto tiles when jumping, so it's possible to over or undershoot your jump and instantly lose lives over pits, making precise jumps across gaps pretty nerve-wracking and easy to misjudge at first due to the perspective. Although one improvement made is that you can find switches that need to be jumped on by walking over them, rather than jumping on every single block you see in the last game, which could get a little tedious. Fortunately, these beginning segments are short, and even with having to pick up rocks to defend yourself, attacking is also done in 8 directions, so you'll definitely want to take advantage of that since enemies won't move diagonally. Once you get past those, you'll wander into a cave full of cave people, and discover that a creature called Yum Yum has been taking their children, and you are of course asked to go save them. We also talk to a caveman named Tink who gives us our first real weapon, a stone axe. Yeah, there's no yo-yo in this game, which is kind of a shame since it's such an iconic part of StarTropics, but I guess given the situation Mike is thrown in, it makes more sense to have a more conventional weapon. As such, it is still an effective means of dispatching enemies, and is oddly satisfying that Mike just repeatedly throws them in order to attack from roughly the same distance the yo-yo would, which is what you'll need when going through the cave to defeat Yum Yum. After doing so and saving the children, Mike comes across an inconspicuously looking block, which he learns from Mika is a tetrad, one of several mystic relics that are hidden throughout time that Hirokan wants us to find. And yes, these really are Tetris pieces, though in the Virtual Console versions they were renamed to simply blocks since Nintendo no longer had those rights to Tetris. It's actually similar to how the yo-yo in the first StarTropics was renamed to the Island Star in later releases because yo-yo is trademarked in Canada. Our bad, I guess. Now that we have our goal in mind, Mike uses the Oxford World Wonder and magic words to transport to more places throughout time to find the rest of the Tetrads, all the while yelling, "Whoa, this is radical!" every time like the 90s dude he is. The premise of traveling to all sorts of famous time periods is a novel way to add variety to the locations Mike has to go through. While the tropical setting in StarTropics 1 was pleasant and did its best to distinguish its chapters, it did start to get a little tiring until it threw in Zoda's ship at the end. With 2, the areas have more distinction, although it does make it more of a series of short trips throughout time rather than one big adventure like before. What does give some of the chapters substance is that you'll run into iconic people of their eras, both fictional and historical, like Cleopatra in Egypt, who will help Mike if she gets her pizza. Yeah, they take some humorous liberties with these characters. I'd say there is more emphasis on humor for the sequel, which given the additional writers and tone of the last game makes sense to do so, but it has mixed results. A lot of it is pretty goofy in that 90s Saturday morning cartoon kind of way, so some of it I do like. While other times, well, keep in mind it is all purely subjective, I just think some gags are a bit much. Like, when you do get Cleopatra her pizza, you just watch her eat every single slice, with the punchline being the name gag reveal on the box. Not really worth the payoff in my opinion. Fortunately, Cleo does take us where we need to go and gives us a more powerful bronze dagger to replace the axe, which is one of 2 weapon upgrades you'll be given. There's actually another type of attack you'll gain in this chapter too. After going through a hedge maze that has a mechanic of only seeing its pass when on higher platforms, a clever way of actually figuring out a hedge maze isn't trivialized by a top-down view, you'll catch up with this monkey that grants you a magical attack called a Psychic Shockwave. It's an attack that has longer range but lower damage than the weapons, though some enemies and obstacles will be required to use the shockwave on. And like the weapons, you get upgraded versions later on that have longer reach, though the catch being that they require a certain amount of hearts to use, otherwise they downgrade to previous versions when your health is below that. The upgraded yo-yos in the first StarTropics actually did this too. Now that I think about it, both the yo-yo and shockwave are in a way a combination of having full health in order to shoot sword beams and requiring a certain number of hearts in order to pick up better swords in The Legend of Zelda, which is a pretty inventive way of using those mechanics together. It is true that the StarTropics games take a lot of inspiration from Zelda, even having a pretty much identical file select system that saves your progress with the battery backup, which Takeda and his R&D 3 team actually made for the North American version of Zelda, by the way. So it can be easy to assume they're Zelda copies just from that. But when you delve into these games, you'll see that while there are obvious similarities and inspiration, StarTropics does in a way to make them stand on its own. Going back to the shockwave, I actually found myself using it pretty often. Sure, the weapons do more damage, I just prefer to take out enemies from a safe distance whenever I could, because one of the more annoying problems StarTropics 2 has is there is little to no hit invincibility, meaning enemies can easily hit-stun you and drain your health very quickly if they swarm you. It wasn't as bad in StarTropics, so why make it more punishing in the sequel? Was it an attempt to balance things because you have more movement control? I wouldn't say that's a great way to shift that balance if that is the case. Oh, and to make things worse, the low health sound is so aggravatingly loud and does not let up. Again, this wasn't nearly as bad in the first game. Did they really need to make it louder so absolutely no one would not notice they're low on health? I guess it makes it all the more necessary to get your health back up with hearts to pick up and the returning potions. There's also these stars that enemies sometimes drop. They recover 1 heart when you get 5 of them, and were in the first game too. Though I never really found them all that resourceful in either game due to the infrequent nature of them appearing, and later on when you have a lot of hearts, recovering just 1 from these is so insignificant. I feel like they could have maybe done something else for 2 instead of simply reusing this, yet they felt the need to adjust the low health sound, which all it did was make you want to actually stick bananas into my ears. Fortunately, the rest of the game sounds fine. Like the soundtrack, with one improvement being that there is more diverse music this time. Don't get me wrong, StarTropics 1 soundtrack was good, it just got pretty repetitive after a while. For as catchy as the dungeon tune was in the first game, it was practically the only music that played during those parts. In StarTropics 2, we actually have more tracks that change for some of the dungeon areas, and they're pretty good to listen to. However, the flip side to having more music in 2 is that some of it isn't as good, particularly with the overworld themes. A lot of them aren't super memorable and kinda drone on. It isn't bad per se, just not as consistent as the rest of the music. That feeling also goes towards the overworlds in general. Despite the time traveling, some areas aren't as interesting, with not much to explore or interact with, essentially serving as hallways to get to one dungeon to the next. Some do offer things you need to solve to be fair, like in the Wild West area where you need to blow up a part of a cliff face that you locate from directions given by a song. And there are more hearts you can find slightly off the beaten path in addition to the ones you gain from progressing the story just like the first game. But other than that, there isn't a whole lot to them at times. Maybe a couple of NPCs to talk to or the occasional maze. The time travel works as a narrative for these set pieces, but it does make it more of a fragmented adventure instead of a consistent one that StarTropics 1 had going. I would even argue that while the nature of the overworlds in the first game are similar, it was more memorable in terms of what you needed to do in each chapter. Of course, I don't think you could top StarTropics' most infamous puzzle of needing to soak an actual letter in water that came with the game to find a code. I actually ended up getting a complete in-box copy of the game to showcase this letter since it's a pretty iconic game collector's item. Though I didn't want to put water on a valuable 30-year-old piece of paper, so thankfully the previous owner simply wrote the code on it, which likely reduced its value. Oh well. As cool as it is to have something like this for a game, it wasn't exactly convenient back then if you didn't have this letter. Thankfully, Virtual Console versions had the code through a letter animation in the manuals, though they didn't include a way to find the code in the NES Switch Online version, oddly enough. I guess Nintendo figured enough people nowadays could just look it up or go, "Hey Fo, what's the code in StarTropics?" But it does lose that sense of immersion of finding the secret code through some Invisible Ink stuff that kids love to do. It's too bad that StarTropics 2 didn't do something like this again, though it is understandable why they didn't from a logistical standpoint. As for the dungeon-like areas in 2, they fare a little better, with a mix of dealing with enemies, platforming, and puzzle solving, which if you were more or less expecting for a sequel of StarTropics, then that likely won't disappoint you. And they do some interesting things now and then, like the one in Leonardo da Vinci's basement being entirely obstacle and puzzle based with no enemies to deal with. It can be a little frustrating since it's platform heavy, but I appreciate the change of pace. Apart from the platforming, I would say the overall level design is at least a little more fair than the first game. One complaint I do have with the original StarTropics is that a lot of its design revolved around trapping unsuspecting players into dying or throwing you back to the beginning of an area, basically forcing some unfair trial and error. Granted, this is more so the fault of 30-year-old game design, but it can still be pretty mean at times, especially for first-time players. StarTropics 2 is thankfully not as mean in that regard, though it does lose some of its luster in other aspects. There isn't as much emphasis on magical items, for instance, which are the items that you find and use from the pause menu. There are still staples like the aforementioned potions for healing, but there's a considerable lack of other items, and the ones that are here are quite limited. Like the snake charm that's only need to be used once, or the star that grants short invincibility, likely a Mario reference, that are found in only one dungeon each. StarTropics 1's magical items were also pretty situational, but had more usefulness. It seems like 2's didn't have as much thought put into them. Same with the additional weapon pickups too. The first game had a decent arsenal of limited use weapons you could find and pick up, often being helpful or even needed given the circumstances. But because 2 focuses more on 8-directional combat with 2 main weapons, other weapon pickups aren't as prevalent. The only one I found that was prominently useful was this kooshball looking 3-way shot that covered a good amount of ground. At this point, it can be easy to see why StarTropics 2 falls a little short of being a superior sequel to StarTropics 1 due to the uneven nature of its design. You can even see that in the graphics. The dungeons and character portraits are a little better in terms of detail, yet most of the overworlds have a lot of blank space, which doesn't help to make them feel any less barren. However, the one thing StarTropics 2 does really well is its final chapter. Big spoiler for this, by the way, as it's a genuine treat for StarTropics fans to discover. It's here you actually go back to the island of Coca-Cola and find out everyone in the village has been turned into boars. And when you go underground, you'll go through a recreation of the first cave level from StarTropics, complete with a funky remix of the cave theme. You even fight the snake boss again, who is now a freaking skeleton. It's such a cool callback. Sure, going through Zoda's ship was also a cool final chapter in the first game, but this is easily the best part of StarTropics 2 that makes it pretty worth getting to at least once if you're a StarTropics fan. That being said, what comes after is a gauntlet of all the bosses in the game, including the 2 forms of Zoda we've already fought. Oh yeah, at one point Mike and Sherlock Holmes discovered that Zoda split into 3 because he just can apparently, on top of traveling through time to try and get the Tetrads. What a cartoony ass villain. After those, we get to fight the final Zoda, though if you die here, you have to do the entire boss rush over again, because old video game is old. Thankfully, you do get a chance to heal and grab a bunch of potions to stock up for these fights beforehand. Once Zoda has been defeated for good, the villagers and Argonians are saved, and the village chief, a self-proclaimed Tetris master, or the less cooler sounding puzzle master in later versions, assembles the Tetras to release King Hirokon. He thanks Mike as he leaves Earth with the Argonians, with Mika in particular giving a bittersweet goodbye to Mike, destroying the hopes and dreams of shippers everywhere. And that was the end of StarTropics 2. It was an okay sequel. It definitely shows its pros and cons that levels out as an alright, but not superior sequel that's often been covered here before. So I can see how it can be considered good or bad depending on how you look at it. Though some aspects like the time-traveling narrative and emphasis on more goofy and self-referential humor may depend more on your own personal tastes, but overall, I'd say I'm in the middle. I don't regret playing it and had my share of laughs and enjoyment. But I would say the first game is consistently better, even with its share of beginner unfriendliness, trappings, and whatnot. Plus, for a late NES sequel that came out 4 years after the first, 2 doesn't seem to take much advantage of that. Still, as a whole, both games are quirky NES adventures that are worth checking out. Getting them physically, even in box, are actually not too expensive compared to most other popular NES games. And while you can't get them on the Wii Virtual Console anymore, they are still on the Wii U Virtual Console as of this video, if you're willing to tolerate the video quality of NES games on the Wii U anyway. StarTropics 1 is also on the NES Classic, and while 1 is on the NES Switch Online games, 2 isn't, at least not yet, so who knows if and when it'll be added on there. I guess the only question left is, will we ever see another StarTropics game? Part of me is kinda doubtful because of its lack of Japanese recognition, but the other part is, who knows, maybe? In this year alone, we've seen series revivals like Streets of Rage 4 and that new Battletoads, both of which were franchises that haven't had a game since the year StarTropics 2 came out, so anything could be possible. I would even accept a remake of the first game. I mean, if Alex Kidd can get one, I don't see why not. Although I wouldn't count it being from the same developers. The last game R&D 3 worked on was Pilot Wing 64, and since the Nintendo 64, they strictly worked on hardware development all the way up to the Wii U and newer 3DS models. By 2015, they merged with Nintendo System Development to become Nintendo Platform Technology Development. who were responsible for a little thing you may have heard of, the Switch. Needless to say, I think they're in a good position now. I also find it funny that you can now play StarTropics on the system the devs would eventually be a part of making. Kinda comes full circle. As for Genyo Takada, he mostly managed the development of Nintendo hardware after StarTropics 2, most notably the N64 analog controller stick and the Wii. Only a couple of things to help him earn a Lifetime Achievement Award from DICE in 2018. He also retired in 2017, so I can't see a new StarTropics game headed by him happening. Although he was a supervisor for Punch-Out on the Wii by Next Level Games, so if anyone were to make a new StarTropics, maybe he could be a consultant or something, unless he really is retired for good. It's understandable for StarTropics fans to want something new after all these years. It's why they tend to freak out whenever any reference to StarTropics comes up because they're so infrequent. It really is one of the most left behind franchises from Nintendo. Even Kid Icarus was in a similar 2-game limbo for years until Super Smash Bros. Brawl brought Pick back from the dead, and then he got a brand new game afterwards. Who knows if StarTropics will ever get that, or any Smash Bros. Representation. Well, outside the games being listed on the Brawl's Nintendo Chronicle list, I'm sure a few people discovered StarTropics got it too through this. And hell, I'm an F-Zero fan, so naturally I'm eager to see anything new after, over 15 years? But for StarTropics fans, it's been over 25, so I can't really complain as much. I still think F-Zero has a better chance of coming back though, but we'll see. And you know what? After playing both StarTropics, I would consider myself a fan of them now, despite the criticisms I had with some of their older game designs. Color me charmed by them. It just goes to show you that even something as old as StarTropics can still get new fans so that it will never truly be forgotten.
Wow. Can you believe that guy? What an ant dude wanna be.
Hey, thanks for watching. Big thanks to James of Nitrorat for actually agreeing to do a Camu bit for this silly thing. Be sure to check out his stuff if you don't quite get where this influence came from. Oh, and I guess maybe check out my other stuff too if you want. I am usually more original than this, I swear.